All right, welcome, Rob. How are you?
Doing great. Good to see you.
Hey, great to see you. I'm joined by my longtime friend Rob Sentz from Moscow, Idaho. Rob, if you would introduce yourself, please.
Yeah. So I've been sort of in the labor market and higher ed and HR world for about 15 years. I work on marketing and research and a lot of content. And I guess lately we've been working a lot on this idea of labor shortage and what to do about it.
Yeah, you understate your impact because you are the founder of a tool called Find Your Calling. You were instrumental in the development and growth of MZ, which is now together with Burning Glass, which has really created the space of talent market analytics. And obviously, it has other naming conventions, but it really looks at the connection between education and employer needs and what's happening at the governmental level at everything from cities, counties, and states. So can you just talk straight into it? We have this labor shortage as perceived by many. We have inflation that is occurring in certain segments and certainly more broadly, which is putting constraints on labor additionally, and as well as budgets. So where are we right now? And as we talk today about talent strategies and what organizations can do, where is your head, where's your energy right now given everything that's happening?
Yeah. I guess, what we see today is further and further, more and more confirmation about the problem, which is we have a huge number of openings. And every study and every survey that comes out, two notable ones have been the Conference Board did one for CEOs where CEOs said, domestic US based CEOs said the number one problem they're having right now, their number one fear is people shortage. And then uh, the National Student Clearinghouse came out and said essentially almost another 500,000 students left higher ed this past year. So we're down in 2 years, down over 1 million students in higher ed. And so all the things that come out just give us more and more evidence that, what demographers started talking about probably 20 plus years ago is this idea of a demographic cliff. And now we're really dealing with it, right?
Mhm.
And it's not one of those problems that we can sort of emerge from. Like the idea of a pandemic is that or a recession is that it's a quick spike, right?
Mhm.
It goes up and it goes down, and you kind of experience that um, roller coaster effect. Whereas I think a labor shortage is going to be a pronounced long-term deal, right? And this is also evidenced by what we see in other countries, places like Japan, most of Europe, Spain, Italy, etc., um, where they just struggle to find enough people for all the work that needs to be done. And so, what I'm doing right now is trying to think about, you know, probably for most employers, most schools, most cities, it's what are short-term things we can do to deal with it, right? Because
Mhm.
if it's going to be with us for a long time, how do we function with it?
Yeah, with that in mind, I know you have some research in the works, and we'll get to that in a little bit. And I want to emphasize the fact that this topic can be daunting to many. It's like, oh
Right.
gosh, what am I going to do? I can't accelerate people through an educational system. I can't all of a sudden make people appear in the geography or in the job family of interest to me. So, in terms of the practical application of this, I want to ask this pointed question. Uh, who needs to be in the discussion from an organizational
Mhm.
perspective?
Yeah.
Because historically, arguably, it's been recruiting or talent acquisition, yet it goes way beyond that. In I
Yep.
know in your view. So with that in mind, yeah, who needs to be in the room talking about this and making decisions?
Well, I do think, given that it is sort of top of mind of, everybody from CEOs to presidents, and I would even say increasingly we'll probably see it become a political issue. Well, this is something that if you think about politicians in places like Europe, or the East, this is a top five pillar for them. A lot of countries where you've had presidents actually do things like say, "Hey, everybody, go home. and we'll give you credits if you have children, right? And those programs never work. So at the highest level, it's got to be people running organizations. And then it does turn into all the people downstream of that. And, typically it's things like recruiting. In the higher ed world, it would be, recruiting, enrollment people. And in companies, it's the strategic HR. But it's got to be sort of everybody, because everybody's dealing with it. If people are the number one problem or lack of, then it's sort of everybody's problem.
Because this affects compensation strategy, it affects location strategy, it affects skills and learning and development strategy. So, can you speak to that insofar as if a company is going to be an employer of choice, if they're going to be attractive, looking at the system and how they can market themselves, and to students and early career professionals, isn't just, correct me if I'm wrong again, a nice to have or a good thing to do out of the goodness of their hearts. It's mission critical. It's
Yeah.
fundamental to their business. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. So I think that if you think about what happened after World War II, we had the baby boom. And as people grew up, 60s, 70s, 80s, we really experienced an abundance of people. And that abundance manifested itself as an abundance of talent. We had, it was the most people we've ever seen go to college. And then we not only were men going to college, but we had women going to college. So we essentially doubled the population of people who were working.
Hmm.
And that was a huge benefit to pretty much every company out there, where they could make a job posting and take their pick of the litter, so to speak. They could find really good people off the shelf. And I don't think, we can still do that today. But what we're starting to see is that growth curve is peaked. And now what will happen is we will start to see a decline, right? That growth curve will start to turn in the other direction. And it's not a curve that we can change back in the upward swing in any kind of short term. So it does mean, like what you just said, is that presence and the effort to get in front of people changes. Where I think what it's been for so long, what we've been so used to, is people lining up for work. Now what we're going to have to do is see work lining up for people.
Interesting. And if you don't mind, I'd like to bring up this study that you're working on. Do you want to talk about this? Because it effectively, correct me if I'm wrong again, reflects what you just asserted, that we
Yeah.
need to think systematically about talent strategy early and often. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So talent strategy was often, you could make a job posting, have 30 people or 50 people, or in some cases, hundreds of people apply to that job. And then you could sit, on your computer, or you could sit in front of whatever system you're using and, narrow in, oh, we'll take the top 5, we'll start interviewing them, and then we'll pick the best one. Right now, what a lot of companies are experiencing is they'll make that same job posting and see far fewer people apply to it, and realize that that's not meeting their needs like it was 10 years ago. And so when we talk about here, what we talked about is early and often, because what, Tallow works with a lot of young people, high school, college age people, and does a lot of surveys with them to better understand their perspective on the labor market, their perspective on education. And really, one of the key things I think they've done is they've asked a lot of key questions about the types of companies you'd want to work for. And over, what comes back is people want to work for companies that are basically making that effort to be in front of them at an early age, essentially building their brand and saying, hey, we want you. We want to have a relationship with you. We want what you can do. And one of the biggest findings that has come out of these studies is that the companies that do that have there's a massive preference. Over 70% of the students that say that the companies that do that are companies that they prefer to work for. The second part of it is those companies also have to show aligned values, right? Many young people today and I'd say pretty much all of us, right? I mean, we're really talking about 3 generations of workers, what we would refer to as early talent, which, Generation Z, today's high school and college age students, the millennials, which is now making really kind of a bulk of the labor market, and then Gen X, which is becoming the older part of the labor market. Baby boomers are leaving the labor market. If you think about the 3 key generations that are composing the market today, the big thing you see about them is how much they want to be values aligned in their work. Money's important, right? But people want to believe in the mission. They want to understand the why and believe in the mission of the company they're working with, right?
Mhm.
And so if companies can be in front of a new generation of talent early and often with their value proposition and here's how we help solve problems and things like that, that's massively appealing. And from a strategy point of view, that's probably how you fill your pipeline with talent, over the next 5 or 10 years. And you might be thinking like, well, we need talent today. We need a sales rep today. We need a nurse today. We need a coder today. We need whatever today. And it's like, yes, that's true. But one of the best ways, and you're going to need that in 5 years. So one of the best things you could be doing right now is to be getting in front of the people who you would be trying to hire in 3 to 5 years and building that relationship. And I think that's kind of a new thing. It probably sounds a little intimidating to some people.
Well, I imagine it does because, to your point, that's longer term thinking that speaks to arguably workforce planning. It speaks to allocating money to the future as opposed to the here and now. And the willingness is lacking oftentimes, but you're highlighting
Yeah.
the critical nature of that. Because if call it high value talent, they're, correct me if I'm wrong, given the labor market dynamics now, have options. So if,
Yes.
do they want to go to a known quantity, something that's been top of mind for them for years, or do they want to go to an organization that they just heard about during the recruiting process? I would imagine the relationship equity that's built up is going to carry the day more often than not. With that in mind, what we're talking about not only screams workforce planning, it screams employment branding, which
Yes.
I haven't heard much of relative to years prior. So we go back 10 years, it was like employment branding is this, and everyone has to do it. So my pointed question is this: is how do organizations actually get in front of students and early career professionals so they're building this relationship equity? What does that look like? Do you have any examples?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think one of the things is it's very much, as we observe it, an employment branding approach is very much like any approach, any marketing approach a firm would take, right?
Mhm.
It looks pretty much identical. And if you think about anybody who uses a solid branding or marketing strategy, there's some real key steps they go through. And this all goes back to the idea if you're online, if you're watching TV, or if you're reading something, in print, you often come across advertisements, right? And they can be very annoying to you, intrusive. It's like, oh, the fun thing about online is you can just sort of X and it just goes away, right? But if you think about it, like, why do companies like Toyota, Pepsi, whatever brand that you're familiar with, why do they do that? Right? You've heard of Toyota before. Why do they keep telling you about Toyota? Well, they understand that there is a strong relationship between how much you see them and how much you buy from them and how much you sort of have that brand equity, that there's a sort of loyalty. And if I flip it, like if I express it in terms of advertising, it's like, yeah, advertising is annoying. But then if I said, let's say you are very invested, let's say Honda was your preferred car. How hard is it for me to get you to stop buying Hondas, right?
Mm.
Or, you remember, probably 10 years back, Apple, right? Where you had Apple fans, where Apple people they would look at your phone or your computer and be like, whoa, what's wrong with you? Why don't you have, right? So if you
Right.
think about like advertising is just a small part of what companies do to build a brand. But when you think about the effect that a strong brand has on you, you develop a high sense of loyalty to that thing, because it might improve your quality of life. It has a mission that you agree with, whatever, right? And you can think about it clothing, food, consumer products, all the way up to professional services that we are very tied to. And I think the thing is, those companies, as they grow, realize that developing and cultivating that audience is as crucial to the product that they make.
Hmm.
And so if we flip that idea that's really played out in marketing, if we flip that idea over into the area of HR, hiring, and recruiting, it's almost the exact same thing.
Hmm.
Where the first thing that anybody who wants to invest in an audience, the first thing they have to do is do their homework and their research on the audience itself. So it tends to start with data, right? So a good marketer would say, you don't want to just splash your product in front of 100 million people. Well, I guess if you're like Pepsi or something, like you do. But in general, what you want to do is segment an audience and say, who are the people that we want to talk to? What do we understand about them? Right.
Hmm.
And so I think if we think about the new generation of talent, it all starts with looking at data. Once you understand that audience and you understand the ideal audience for you, then you have to start to question how they think about you, what they're after, and how will you build a brand that really resonates with them. Now we're talking about that in the context of employment, right? Not in the context of selling them something. You're talking to them in the context of employment. And then after that, it turns into strategy. And then after that, it turns into what campaigns, what things do you actually do in reality to work with them. And there's a
Yeah.
lot of examples. Yeah.
That's it. I'm glad you landed there, because that's exactly where I was going, or my head was going, because
Mm-hmm.
it's one thing to see a logo splash up, as you're
Yeah.
scrolling through Instagram or something. It's another thing to hear a story of something great that's happened within that company, particularly if that story relates to who you are at the present time or an imminent you.
Right.
And what
Mm-hmm.
I want to get to is there are many organizations now that are offering students or early career professionals incentives to join them. Can you speak to some of the offerings that are out there that you see working?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So oddly enough, developing a good strategy and a good brand around employment, if you try to be slick or gimmicky, those things actually really work against you.
Mm.
One of the pieces of research that we've seen is if you essentially invade, so you imagine some big corporation invading young people's TikToks with their message, right? That's a bad idea. No, don't, nobody wants you doing that. Like they're on there hanging out with their friends, and all of a sudden this corporation shows up and it's like, hey, we're cool and relevant. It's like that Steve Buscemi meme. And so like there's the first thing is don't try to be slick and relevant. But when we actually go back and look at the data, that same audience, so a high school student, a college student, is actually highly interested in the company insofar as the company talks about what the company's about, what it's like to work there, and the types of people who get jobs there.
Mm.
It should be straightforward, educational, and it does not need to really try to go appeal to high school students.
Mm.
And then the other thing we found is how effective even things like an email are to a core group of people who have an interest in that area. So let's say you're interested in teaching. An organization that does a lot of teaching, sending an email saying, we see that you're interested in teaching. We want to tell you a little bit about what we do. And then have somebody actually from the company talk about it is highly effective. And so then if you can essentially teach that audience what your company's about, what it's like to work there, think about like a field trip. I remember when I was a little kid, I remember doing a field trip to probably like the local McDonald's, where somebody took us through all the operations behind the scenes. And I still remember it. I was probably like 7 or 8 years old, and how amazing it was, right? To the people who work there, they're like, "Oh, this is terrible and boring." But to me, it was like, "This is amazing," right?
I thought you were going to say 7 or 8 years ago. I was going to call you
Yeah,
out on that.
yeah, a little younger
But
than that. Yeah.
no,
But I mean, like, it's that concept of like, let us show you what our company's like, because every young person today knows that they need to enter the labor market, knows that employment is something they have to do, and it's somewhat elusive. How do I learn about it? How do I meet people who do it? And they don't want to be pandered to. They know I'm going to be an adult. So what's that like? And so I think educational content is huge. And then things like internships, it's all the ships, right? The internships, the apprenticeships, the mentorships, the scholarships, all the things that companies do to invest down into the next generation are extremely effective. Now, and again, in the world of recruiting, which is a lot like the world of sales, they're like, but I need it now. I need it tomorrow. And it's like, that's true, yes. But the best way to get it tomorrow is thinking about what you're doing 3 to 5 years ahead of time, so that you're sort of, reaping the reward of winning that audience over time.
So it's an and at the end of the day is what I'm hearing. And do you
Yeah.
see enough investment? Where does this land? I mentioned talent acquisition. I mentioned workforce planning. Is this a workforce planning initiative? Is this an employment branding initiative? Is this related to employee experience and getting the word out there? I mean, where does this land
Yeah, I
within an
think it's probably
organization?
all of it. It probably depends on the company a little bit, how the
Mhm.
company's set up and who does that. But I think like any good thing, you think about any good product that's made is, somebody's in charge of it, and they have resources to execute, right?
Mhm.
And
Right.
there needs to be a top-down vision at the company that says, "Hey, we really think this is important."
Right.
Right? So, a company's highly invested in making its product or service, right? If it's a coffee company, it's obsessing about the quality of its, coffee. If it's a car company, it's the car. I think what companies need to do is take that exact same mentality and then adopt it into its people strategy. The
Mm.
same level of care that they would give to making their product, they have to be giving to making the people, because the people are the ones that really drive the company forward and make the quality product. So I
You know,
think
I,
it's the same approach.
Yeah, I love what you're saying, and I imagine if among our viewers and listeners, they're nodding their head and go, "Yes, yes, yes." However,
Yeah,
this initiative, this budget is falling through the cracks. It's because, to your
right.
point, it's the here and now wins the day, and thus we're not prepared for tomorrow and certainly the day after tomorrow. So, I hope as we are dealing with this labor shortage, talent shortage, that there's an awakening to making this a priority. Because correct me if I'm wrong, if this is not a priority, winning tomorrow and the day after tomorrow is going to be
Right.
increasingly hard. It's not going to get easier. Yeah.
Nope. Yeah, exactly. And I think
Right.
it's a movement from, we have had the luxury to be very tactical, right? Just, one seat, fill it tomorrow, that kind of thing. What people need to get used to is having to be a far more strategic,
Mm.
right? Like big picture, lots of people. How do we segment? How do we get down? And how do we build a relationship over time? That's strategic thinking. It takes time, and I think that's the big difference. Is the win tomorrow. The way to win tomorrow is by investing 3 or 5 years ahead of time.
With this in mind, I hit my mic. Sorry. And there's so much we can explore here, and we're going to have you back to do some of that exploration, because building relationships with academic institutions,
Yeah.
with regional economic boards, and really looking at the system in which you're doing business. And again, I am an advocate of stakeholder relationship management, people data for good, all that. I'm also a business person insofar as that this is mission critical. This is not just a nice to have. So I'm not going to pontificate on that right now. I just want to call it out. And I want to ask this question before we wrap, is that many companies are, and again, if you think differently, please let me know, are offering financial incentives, paying for education, for
Yeah.
example, to elevate this sense of loyalty and potentially even contractually oblige them to have a certain tenure of
Mhm.
service,
Yeah.
after the fact, particularly in jobs that, there's supply demand is way off. There's gross
Yeah.
undersupply of
Mhm.
talent. Um, do you think that is something that is going to increase? And if organizations are not doing it now, do you think that's something that they should increasingly look into? Is writing a check for the
Mhm.
education of someone, offering an internship that's paid to actually have that, just fill the pipeline earlier?
Yeah. Oh, I think it's absolutely happening, and I think what you described there is what every company is going to be doing versions
Mm,
of.
mhm,
Think about the cost of higher ed and how much that's been a topic for a good 20 years. The price has gone through the roof, but people were still paying it because there was sort of a return on on investment. Now people had a lot of debt. One of the things that's starting to happen is businesses increasingly are saying, "Hey, we will foot that bill." Think about, you've got Target, Starbucks, Apple, Microsoft, um, you've got things like Guild, where, a young person today, if you're 16 or 17, I think one of the things you should be thinking is, man, if I go get a job at one of these companies, it could even be in retail, they're going to pay for my school. And if I stick around for 2 or 3 or 4 years, I'll be getting paid. Maybe it's 15, $18 an hour, which isn't bad for them. Plus, these companies are going to reimburse or pay for my education. So all of a sudden, that getting into 80 or $100,000 in debt because of school, that whole equation changes pretty big. And it's because a lot of companies are starting to play down in the education space, and they
mhm,
realize it actually helps them retain talent. I also feel like we're going to see the sort of the re-advent of that. Remember the phrase "I'm a GE man,"
mhm,
where it was the picture of somebody who starts at a company. Maybe they didn't go to college and they started a company when they're 16 or 18 years old, doing one of the entry level, low level jobs, and then they're 65 years old and they retire from that company. They worked their entire, they worked in 5 or 10 different jobs in that company over time.
mhm,
I feel like we're heading back towards something like that, where companies are so invested in keeping that lifelong person that they invest in them. They help them with their education. They help them basically with all kinds of things because they cannot afford to lose them.
mhm.
And, I think it's kind of fascinating to think about. And if we do look at the survey data amongst, high school and college age students, they do say that they prefer to stay at a company longer
Mhm.
now. There
Yeah.
is a big shift in their attitude. It's there People are not wanting to job hop, or at least young people don't really want to job hop like we've seen, maybe millennials or Gen X do. So
Yeah,
it's kind of
and
fascinating.
historically, yeah, and it is super fascinating. And historically,
Mhm.
people job hop because they can get more job and get
Yeah.
appreciated, and get more income
Yep.
by doing that. So if employers get ahead of it and reduce that reality and
Yep.
offer educational incentives, say I'm developing
Mhm.
plus something that needs to be called out is that feasibly I can create more stability in terms of where I live because there's a
Yes.
cost to moving each time, even within the same region. So, and
Mhm.
I know the transaction costs of housing moves, whether it be renting or owning, are increasingly high. So,
Yeah.
yeah, I think as you articulate that, I believe that to be true, and I think there's intention behind that, or there should be
Mhm.
intention behind that. So, Rob,
Yep.
we're definitely going to have to talk about this
Sure.
again.
Happy to.
Once this research report comes out, when is that going to be released?
Yeah, we're in final edit right now. My hope is in the next 30 days or so, we'll have it out there.
Okay. Well, we'd be
Yeah, and
sure
it's
to, highlight that on our website, give you props, and get that out. If you're just join us midway through. I'm with Rob Sentz. He has been a leader in talent market analytics space. Is that what you call it, Rob? What do you call it succinctly?
yeah, I think just labor market analytics and yeah, lately it's been a lot more about demographics.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate you doing what you do. Learn from you each time we interact. So look forward to talking again. So thanks for being here today, and hopefully we'll get together in person before too long. Yeah.
Love to. Thanks,
All
Al.
right. Likewise. All right. Be well, Rob. Appreciate you.
You too. See ya.